Oh, Susan, listen to that fife and drum corps. That can only mean one thing. Here we are, finally, the Army's 250th birthday. I am your host, Sean Kief, along with my co-host, Susan Thompson. Welcome back to Aberdeen Proving Ground's Hidden History, and today is a very special episode because we will be celebrating the Army's 250 years and Aberdeen Proving Ground's role.
Well, it's been a long time coming, Sean, and I think we're all excited that it's finally here.
You want to know how long?
250
years. That's right. Here again, bringing it to the table. Me knowing the numbers.
Well, I'm very impressed with your calculations there, Sean.
Stop it. But no, I'm very excited because 250 years, older than the nation itself. I love that line.
That's right. While not 250 years old, Aberdeen Proving Ground does have over 100 years of history supporting the Army, our nation, the warfighter, and making sure that those important pieces of technology that evolve over time get out to the soldiers so that they can use them and be successful.
Makes you all warm inside. I mean, I'm getting kind of emotional over here. So I say we just take it from the top. And as we have said many times before, Aberdeen Proving Ground was established in 1917. And that was because of Sandy Hook Proving Ground in New Jersey just was not large enough to meet the nation's need.
And one of the reasons for that is that it's the small peninsula of land that sticks out into the harbor across from New York. The largest range they had, land range, was less than 4 miles long.
That's crazy.
When you think about Aberdeen Proving Ground and its 66,000 acres of ranges, it's a huge difference in the capabilities just for the land mass alone. So Aberdeen Proving Ground was really created to meet the needs of a new type of warfare that was happening on the battlefields of France. Warfare continuously evolves. We've learned this over time. But it was evolving rapidly in Europe. There were new weapons, there were new methods of engagement. It was trench warfare. There were extreme changes in what was happening. And the Proving Ground at Sandy Hook just could not meet those needs anymore. So they decided they needed a new place to test the weapons, to test the material. And that, as we talked about in the past, became Aberdeen Proving Ground. At the same time that Aberdeen Proving Ground was being developed, the field of ballistics was also evolving and advancing. And Aberdeen Proving Ground has always been under the command of Ordnance, the Ordnance Department. And that's what it was for a long time, but that's what its purpose was originally.
And I'm super smart. And I'm very familiar with all these terms, but our audience could be very diverse and not familiar with, say, something as simple as ballistics. Can you explain what that means?
Yes, certainly. The science of ballistics is all about how projectiles operate both within and once it's fired from a weapon. So how it operates within a weapon is called internal ballistics. And once a projectile leaves the muzzle, the barrel of a gun, that's called exterior ballistics.
Okay. So is that to determine how far, say, a bullet travels or how much damage a bullet can do?
It's all of that. It's how it travels through the air. It's how it's affected by the wind, by the weather, by types of powder and things that send it out of the gun. So it's a very...
And that still exists to this day.
Yes.
I mean, the weapons have gotten better, but the testing is still the same.
Yes, and that is true. But you have to remember in World War I, when Aberdeen Proving Ground was established and they were doing the testing of weapons, there was something established called the Proof Department. And the Proof Department was doing some of these basic testing. And in cooperation with the Proof Department was the instrument section. And this is how they did the testing of the ballistics. And at the time, the Army and everyone was operating with fairly old technology. So what we had was called the Boulogne chronograph. And
okay. This is interesting.
yeah, so that was used to measure the velocity of a bullet exiting a gun. And that was something they needed to know when determining their range firing tables, to know how fast something was leaving a gun. But the Boulogne chronograph was a really big piece of equipment, and it was required to be used in a lab because it had to be put onto a vibration-proof pier. So they were really limited. This had been developed in 1867.
Wow.
So at the time of World War I, it was already 50-year-old technology.
Okay.
So once the Ordnance Department was established at Aberdeen Proving Ground, they realized they needed to improve that chronograph. So they eventually developed what was called the Aberdeen chronograph.
Nice name. I like it. I like it. Fits in really well here.
They experimented over time, and by March of 1918, they had developed this Aberdeen chronograph. And it was a little bit different from the Boulogne chronograph, principally in that it used a projectile to complete rather than break a circuit. So that made it as accurate as the Boulogne, but it was much more portable. They could use it in the field. They could use it anywhere that they had electrical power. So it was a vast improvement over the typical technology. So at the very beginning of our history, back in 1918, we were innovating, we were improving, we were making sure that we had the equipment and the technologies to support the soldier.
Could you say we were the home of innovation?
I could say that, Sean.
Oh, that's, we should start using that today.
I think that's a great idea.
Oh, good. I'm going to put a word in with my supervisor.
Okay. So as I talked about, exterior ballistics is that part of science dealing with the behavior of projectiles in flight once they leave the muzzle of a weapon. But there were other things that were changing during World War I. One was the way that they used artillery. So they used to fire just straight into oncoming troops. During World War I, they started doing elevated artillery where they'd fire over the heads of their soldiers into oncoming soldiers. So they had to come up with brand new ways to measure how that came.
They never did that prior?
Kind of a new tactic in World War I. And another thing that really changed was the use of airplanes. And firing from airplanes, because this was a totally new technology. So by the time you're firing and they were using fuse technologies, they were detonated by time fuses, which meant that their position at any moment in their flight had to be known. So really, a lot of what was happening was trying to figure out the firing tables for how bullets operate in flight, how projectiles operate. And you have to figure even during World War I that the speed of aircraft was sufficient so that adjustments had to be made within a few seconds to make sure that those weapons were effective.
I can't believe I get paid to sit here and listen to this. This is absolutely wonderful. Very interesting. We're 5 minutes and 10 minutes into the episode, and I'm already learning something.
That work that was done here at Aberdeen Proving Ground was really instrumental to the effectiveness of the soldier in World War I. It's not very much talked about, but the fact that we were developing new technologies, and because the face of warfare was changing and we were responding to those requirements.
Could you say we were an army in transformation?
You also could say that, Sean.
All these ideas, I got to speak to leadership over this.
So not only was important work being done at Aberdeen Proving Ground, as we talked about 2 episodes ago, there was also important work being done at Edgewood Arsenal. Talked about the development of chemical weapons and the development of that, but also they were doing other innovative work, testing methods for dispersing chemical agents from aircraft. Again, a new weapon, aircraft, that hadn't been used in war before. They also, this was a little bit after the war, but they were developing improved gas masks and means of impregnating clothing for protection against toxic gases. In addition to all that, they were also doing some investigation with insecticides, especially for use on naval ships. So we weren't only supporting the Army, we were supporting the Navy and everyone else. So again, as we celebrate the Army's 250th birthday, I think it's important for us to stop and reflect and look back at how important Aberdeen Proving Ground and Edgewood Arsenal have been to the success of the Army over time. World War II, after entering the war in December 1941, Aberdeen Proving Ground again became the Army's main testing facility for both ordnance and vehicles. So there was a lot of work happening at APG focused on research and experimental testing of new ordnance equipment. And these are some really interesting numbers, I think. They were so successful, and you just don't think about it. By 1945, there were over 1,860 major ordnance items used.
Wow.
Only 350 of those were designed prior to 1940. So that means over 1,500 major ordnance items were developed and tested at Aberdeen. They weren't all developed at Aberdeen Proving Ground, but were developed and then tested at Aberdeen Proving Ground in order to support the war. So between 1940 and 1945, that's a huge increase.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, that's just an amazing volume of work to think about.
Mm-hmm.
So not only were we testing ordnance, we were training ordnance soldiers here at Aberdeen Proving Ground. In 1936, the ordnance schools were consolidated at Aberdeen Proving Ground. They had been active during World War I, and they were at a couple of different locations, one up at Raritan Arsenal up in New Jersey again, that came down to Maryland, and one at Watertown Arsenal in New York. Again, it's all the activity that was in New Jersey and New York, which had become...
We just keep sucking them dry, don't we?
Those were more populated areas. So if you move the schools to a less populated area, there's more room for development, and which Aberdeen Proving Ground totally had to do during World War II. They were buying property, they were expanding. The schools, the buildings weren't built until beginning in 1938. So the schools were in place by 1940.
And if you're familiar with the Proving Ground at all, the big stone buildings that still exist, most of those were built in 1938 for the Ordnance School.
Yes, that's totally correct. So they did a little bit different type of training in World War II than they did in World War I. In World War I, they were training ordnance companies as units. And in World War II, they shifted to training individual soldiers in their required ordnance-related skills. So rather than training as unit, they were bringing in individual soldiers and learning these skills. And they were really focused on a practical, technical, hands-on training. And it culminated in a one-week field program in which soldiers diagnosed and repaired broken equipment while on a bivouac. And
A what?
A bivouac when they were out doing their little...
I'm sorry. Say that again, please.
Bivouac. Bivouac.
What is that?
You've never heard of I don't know.
You're okay. Do you know who you're talking to here? A bivouac? I've never heard that before. What is it?
A bivouac is basically a temporary camp or shelter. So they're basically going out into the field and pretending like they're on the front.
Wow.
And they're fixing things.
Okay.
So it's a practice exercise.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah.
Hey, just learned a new word. It's like Sesame Street over here.
Elmo says, "Good job, Sean."
Thank you. Aw. Touched.
So the graduates of the Ordnance School really played a vital role in the Allied victory in World War II. Their ability to fix and maintain equipment really eased some of those logistical burdens on commanders. It's just like what we need soldiers to do today, and that we work for training them to fix the equipment, make sure they can repair things in the field so that the equipment is ready to go.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, Aberdeen Proving Ground is no longer the home of ordnance that left us behind.
And they were here for how many years? Was it
68 years.
68 years.
Aberdeen Proving Ground was the home of ordnance. So it was a sad day for Aberdeen Proving Ground after the 2005 BRAC when they moved. But they will always have a place in APG's history and their heart.
So after BRAC, that happened in 2005, the highest ranking officer on the installation was one two-star general, and that was with RDECOM. And then you had the ordnance general, who was a one-star. I remember General Naidu, who was the two-star general of RDECOM at the time. And when BRAC was announced, he had said that Aberdeen Proving Ground had pretty much been at the bottom of the barrel for the Army. Mm-hmm. And now it's in the top three. And now what do we have? Like 5 2-star generals on the installation?
That's true. It's really grown over time. So.
Yeah. I remember them calling it the Bermuda Triangle, the way that all the new commands were set up. But it's really exploded after BRAC here at Aberdeen.
And it is interesting if you look at the commanding officers of Aberdeen Proving Ground, there wasn't a general officer in charge until the World War II timeframe. Before that, it was always colonels.
Colonels, because Colonel Ruggles was our first installation commander.
That's true. And he did go on to become chief of ordnance.
Yeah, and he built a wonderful golf course before he left.
So realizing that ordnance and ballistics is sort of the lifeblood of what created Aberdeen Proving Ground and what Aberdeen Proving Ground was during World War II. One of the most important facilities was the Ballistics Research Laboratory.
BRL.
Which was part of Ordnance originally. So we talked about this with our very first episode, Sean.
With Edwin Hubble, correct?
With Edwin Hubble. But one of the major innovations that happened during the war at BRL was the construction of a supersonic wind tunnel.
That just sounds awesome.
And it was considered the greatest single forward step taken in ballistic instrumentation at the research laboratory during World War II. So it was a really important piece of technology, enabling us to do really forward-looking
And Hubble
research.
used the wind tunnel, correct?
Yes. So even though, as we talked about, he had no idea what external ballistics was, and he had to look it up before he started here. But he was closely associated with the California Institute of Technology. It was a professor from the CIT in 1940, Professor von Karman, who had served during the war as a member of BRL's Scientific Advisory Committee that recommended the construction of the wind tunnel at APG for Ordnance Department ballistic research.
Now, can you elaborate on what exactly a wind tunnel does?
So a wind tunnel is a pretty basic idea. It's a big tube, and they run fans in it so that you can simulate the motion of flying for various, whether it's airplanes, whether it's rockets, whether it's bombs, whether it's projectiles. So
these are weapons that would have like fins?
Fins. The research that was being done mostly at APG during World War II did focus on bombs, rockets, and other fin-stabilized projectiles.
There we go.
So I'm sure smaller wind tunnels would focus on projectiles and seeing how they travel in the air. And they could do that in various ways. They could inject like dye or smoke so that they could see how the wind...
I've seen that before. I've actually photographed.
Or they could put little flags on the back of whether it's a model or a full scale.
So if you didn't have the wind tunnel, what would you be using? Would you be out on the range?
You'd have to be out on the field, but with the wind tunnel, you can control the conditions.
Gotcha.
So like how, what happens if it's at Mach 4?
Ooh.
Does it blow apart?
Oh, okay.
They were really trying to get those really high speeds, and that happened in the second iteration of the wind tunnel. The Ballistics Research Laboratory not only was using the wind tunnel, but they also had the most modern equipment to help them develop new firing tables.
Okay.
A firing table was basically a document that allowed a soldier to adjust for conditions in the field in order to make sure that they were accurate and lethal with their firing. To calculate these firing tables was a lot of work. A person doing a 60-second trajectory, so mapping how a bullet would fly for 60 seconds, a skilled person doing it by hand with a calculator could do it in 20 hours. What the BRL had access to was called the Bush Differential Analyzer.
Wow.
And that was a mechanical computer. And using that, someone could calculate that same trajectory in 15 minutes.
Wow.
So the problem with the Bush Differential Analyzer was that it was all mechanical, and it really broke down frequently.
Oh, no.
So you have to realize that these firing tables were of vast importance to the field. This is how soldiers knew how to fire, when to fire, given conditions, to make sure that they were effective. So the faster people could get them out, the better. So not only were we doing this type of experimental development. Aberdeen Proving Ground was still testing many of the key weapons and vehicles used during World War II. The carbine, the submachine gun, one of your favorites, the bazooka, which was an anti-tank weapon.
Yeah.
The Sherman tank, the Pershing tank, all these types of guns, anti-aircraft guns. During the war, APG tested about 14 million rounds.
Wow.
And dropped 115,000 bombs during the war. Just think about that. You think we hear the sounds of freedom now?
Yeah.
Imagine what you were hearing in World War II.
Wow.
So,
and just to pick up on that, Susan, one vehicle that was tested here at Aberdeen Proving Ground was the general purpose vehicle, which was known as the GP, which is the Jeep.
that's right, Sean. So it was the Army's new light reconnaissance vehicle that was meant to replace aging motorcycles and Model T trucks.
Aging motorcycles, you get the Jeep. But I just found it so interesting that, GP evolved into Jeep, just
Right.
GP.
And actually, I read a little bit more about that sort of threw a little doubt on the general purpose. So basically, the Army contracted with 3 different companies to develop this vehicle. Mm-hmm. The first was the American Bantam Car Company, and they came up with the first design, but it was overweight.
Okay.
So then 2 other companies came in, the Willys Overland and the Ford Motor Company. So the Ford Motor Company had named it the GP model. It was a government contract. That was the G. And the P referred to an 80-inch wheelbase that they were testing on. So really what I've read is that...
So general purpose is wrong?
I mean, this is basically this is what Motor Trends.
Motor Trend? We're going off of that?
But so there's a little bit of mystery behind where the term Jeep
came from. So it could be general purpose.
It could be general purpose. It could be GP for government, and then P was the wheel model base. Evidently, the term Jeep had been used in the military, even going back to World War I. It was for any vehicle or person that was being tested.
Now I feel like I need to reevaluate my whole life. I've just been living a lie.
But it is interesting that something that was a military term, Jeep, came into the public.
I guess they didn't copyright it.
Actually, Willys Overland applied for a copyright in 1943.
Well, there's a Willys Jeep.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. So they were like one of the first producers along with Ford.
Okay.
And they didn't actually get the copyright until 1950 because there was so much confusion over who owned the term, how it developed. Early advertisements for it used the term Jeep, but it had it in quotes. Jeep in quotes, because they weren't calling it a Jeep yet. But so really it wasn't until after 1950 that they earned the copyright for the name Jeep and started using that.
You know what? I think I need to just take a break and reevaluate my whole life right now.
All right.
June 14th, 1775. The United States Army was established by the Continental Congress. Since the Battle of Lexington and Concord on April 19th, the War for Independence was considered a regional rebellion in New England. The Continental Congress made it a national fight on June 14th, when it resolved that 6 companies of expert riflemen be immediately raised in Pennsylvania, 2 in Maryland, and 2 in Virginia. Once formed, they were sent to join the Army near Boston to be employed as light infantry. The Congress also adopted the New England Army of Observation, officially creating the Continental Army with direct lineage to our Army today. So happy birthday to America's senior service, the United States Army. For more information about the Army's proud history, go to history.army.mil.
All right, Susan. So I had some time to think about this. And by thinking about this, it's a quick Google search. And the origin of the name Jeep is shrouded in some mystery. The most widely accepted explanation is that it originated from the military abbreviation GP, which stood for General Purpose. And Google never lies. So, Susan, I think you've been sitting on a throne of lies this whole time.
Well, regardless of where the name originates, General Dwight D. Eisenhower named the Jeep one of the 4 most important weapons of World War II.
Hallelujah.
Along with the bazooka, the C-47 Skytrain, and the atomic bomb. So,
wow.
So it's in good company.
Yeah, I was ready to say, wow.
So we've really been focused on the contributions of Aberdeen Proving Ground to World War II, but Edgewood Arsenal also had a significant role in a very famous raid of World War II called the Doolittle Raid.
Doolittle Raid. Now, I am familiar with that. And that was also referred to as the Tokyo Raid, but Doolittle is just such a fun thing to say.
Right. So it was named for Lieutenant Colonel James H. Doolittle, and who led this raid. It happened in April of 1942, and it was really the U.S.'s response to Pearl Harbor. President Roosevelt felt that morale was kind of low. He felt that America really needed to see that we were capable of fighting back against Japan. So they planned this raid, and they used incendiary bombs that were produced at Edgewood Arsenal.
And Susan, I know all the answers to my own questions, but could you let our audience know what incendiary means? How is that different than just a regular bombing?
Right. So incendiary bombs weren't technically bombs because they weren't explosive. They were filled with chemicals closely related to what was called thermite that would ignite upon hitting and mixing, and it would burn things. So these were meant to burn oil tanks, warehouses, factories, things like that. And this was a surprise raid that we launched from the USS Hornet. And they flew over mostly Tokyo and dropped these incendiary bombs. It was first announced over Radio Tokyo. The United States was fairly quiet about it until later in April when President Roosevelt confirmed that we had attacked Japan. And when pressed for the name of the base used by bombers, Roosevelt replied, "They came from our new secret base at Shangri-La." Shangri-La was a made-up place that was in the book Lost Horizon, which was published in like the 1920s or 1930s. It was considered a remote, mysterious Himalayan mountain town in this fantasy novel. So immediately the Japanese began searching for what that base was and realized that it was probably the U.S.-held Midway Island was the location. So the raid really led to the Battle of Midway.
Wow.
In June of 1942. And that was really a devastating defeat for Japan. They lost four of its best aircraft carriers. It really turned the tide of war against them. So when you look back and you think Edgewood Arsenal played this very important role in developing and producing the bombs that then went on to create this cascade of effects that led to the Battle of Midway.
That's really interesting.
And the incendiary bombs, this was the first use of them dropped from planes. And they evidently worked really well. An after-action report with Colonel Doolittle and the chief of the Chemical Warfare Service branch revealed that they worked perfectly, setting things on fire the way they were meant to.
That's incredible. So where do we go from here?
So now we're going to shift our focus away from the wars and turn towards what was happening sort of at the tail end of World War II and then in the post-World War II era and then into the early Vietnam era. Aberdeen Proving Ground, of course, had so many innovations, developments. There's no way we could cover them all in the course of one podcast. So we're picking and choosing the things to focus on.
Highlighting. It's a highlight reel.
So you can't talk about Aberdeen Proving Ground without talking about the ENIAC.
Yes. I was wondering when you were getting there. I've been, sitting on the edge of my seat this whole time because this is a very important topic here. Right. It's even got its own sign out on Route 22, right?
That's right. ENIAC was the world's first digital computer. So ENIAC is an acronym for Electronic Numerical Integrator and Computer. So as I mentioned a little bit earlier, the Ballistics Research Laboratory was working on all these firing tables during World War II. And they were using this thing called the Bush Differential Analyzer, which was kind of like a completely mechanical computing in the basic sense, meaning doing calculations machine. And as I said, it took about 15 minutes for someone using a Bush Differential Analyzer to calculate that 60-second firing trajectory. But the problem with the Bush Differential Analyzer was that it would break frequently. And the one we had here at Aberdeen Proving Ground was smaller than the one that they had up in Philadelphia at the University of Pennsylvania Moore School for Electrical Engineering. We contracted to use their larger Bush differential analyzer. And growing out of this was the idea that instead of relying on mechanical computing, they needed to move into electronic computing.
Okay.
So it was the shift that happened. And the ENIAC was developed at the Moore School of Engineering up at the University of Pennsylvania under contract to the Ordnance Department.
Okay.
It was developed to support the Army's firing tables. So the whole reason for the computer age, I'm exaggerating a little bit.
No,
but again,
there's a lot of truth to it.
The Army is developing new resources and new technologies to support the ever-evolving face of warfare, and the computer is one of the outgrowths of that.
Was the ENIAC located at Aberdeen Proving Ground?
It eventually was relocated here in 1947.
And what everyone needs to understand is that this was a huge machine. This wasn't like a tabletop computer. It took up pretty much...
It was in 30 cabinets. It weighed 30 tons.
Wow.
It had 19,000 vacuum tubes.
So I'm going to add this. So when Dr. Atwater was the curator of the Ordnance Museum, they had one of those sections in the museum.
Right.
And what I was told by Dr. Atwater was that at one time, something went wrong.
Yeah.
So they started to take apart the machine. And what they found was that a moth had gotten in where the tubes were.
Right. And that's the
bug. Which put a bug. Okay, just steal my sunshine, why don't you? Yes, that's how your machine has a bug in it.
Right. So it's an interesting piece of history. And you have to realize these were brand new experimental things. So the average length that they could get the ENIAC to work was 5.6 hours before it needed repair.
Wow.
5.6 hours. So you think, our computer support is bad.
Yeah. And there's photos out there. If you want to Google, you'll see how large this machine actually was.
Right. But
it was massive.
But the value of it, remember my comments about 20 hours versus 15 minutes? The ENIAC could do those same calculations in 30 seconds.
Wow.
So it's just...
and now you can do it on your phone in less than that.
It's just an extreme, movement forward and how quickly you could do these calculations that were in support of these firing tables. And the ENIAC really led the computer field during the period from 1949 to 1952. It served as the main computation workhouse for the nation. It was really a major instrument for all the ballistic tables for the U.S. Army and the Air Force. It was also used for weather prediction, for atomic energy calculations, cosmic ray studies, thermal ignition, random number studies, wind tunnel design, and lots of other uses. So
incredible.
There were really no other electronic computers being applied to commercial problems until about 1951. So we were on the forefront of this computer development. They quickly realized there were issues with the ENIAC. It was a data flow computer. There was no central memory. So basically, the numbers would just flow through the machine based on sparks, and then it would tabulate at the end based on a card interface. But there was no internal memory for it.
Wow.
So they really, developed it over time. Then they moved on to the EDVAC, which was the electronic discrete variable computer. And that was the first binary coded decimal computer.
That's a lot of big words right there for me.
That's a lot of words. I'm not a computer person. There are people who are very smart on this, and those are the resources that I use to look at this, a history of the computer that was written by the Ballistics Research Laboratory in 1961. So it really marked the beginning of widespread use of electronic computing machines. And then that just skyrocketed. Investment rates in computing equipment in the United States rose from $10 million per year in 1953 to $100 million per year in 1956.
Ooh.
That's just exponential growth. And then by 1961, forget it. So there's really a lot of amazing things that have happened out of the needs of the Army. And as my final transition, as we're talking about the needs of the Army was used to working in a very when there was a war. It was considered that it would take place in Northern Europe. That was what we were used to. During World War I, during World War II, that was the doctrine. That was how we were trained. So during the Vietnam era, when guerrilla warfare really took off, there was a whole ball game, really, that the Army was having to deal with. We had to figure out how to fight in a different environment. So during the late 1950s, early 1960s, there was a noticeable increase in the incidence of subversive insurgency throughout the world. The U.S. Army found that despite its arsenal of modern material of war, troops were not always prepared to meet the new requirements that arose in counterinsurgency. One of the ways they dealt with this was to create what was called the U.S. Army Limited War Laboratory, and that was established at Aberdeen Proving Ground, Maryland, on 15 June 1962.
What was that name again?
It was the Limited War Laboratory.
Never heard of it.
Right. Amazing, isn't it? All these
really
fascinating
is.
things.
Wow.
So this limited warfare laboratory was later renamed the Land Warfare Laboratory. It only existed for 12 years, between 1962 and 1974. So it pretty much aligned with our involvement in Vietnam.
Was it down in Edgewood? Or
No, it was up here at APG North. So in 1967, it reached its peak with 20 military and 133 civilian personnel. So it was never a huge laboratory, but it was very interesting. Their mission was to provide a centralized research and development activity responsible for meeting Army operational requirements related to limited war, particularly to war of low intensity in underdeveloped or remote areas of the world. There were existing research development capabilities, but what this limited warfare laboratory was meant to do was focus on problems brought to them from the field and do a turnaround. Their time frame was 6 to 18 months. So very fast turnaround for projects. And this is a problem that we're talking about today. How do we get things developed quickly and out to soldiers in the field? Because the Army acquisition process is...
Since the beginning of the Army,
Right.
250 years ago, that has always been a mainstay, is how do we get it out quicker?
Right. So this laboratory was really focused on trying to improve, speed up the process to get things out to soldiers. So they had different areas where they focused on. They had a munitions branch, a mobility branch, an environmental or survival branch, an applied chemistry branch, an applied physics branch, and then also a biological sciences branch. And they really relied on top-notch scientists who were kind of not only specialists in their field, but had broad ranges of expertise. They had mechanical, electrical, chemical, sanitary, aeronautical engineers, chemists, physicists, a botanist, biologists, zoologists, geographers, anthropologists, physiologists, and operations analysts.
Wow.
And many people had double expertise. Like there was an electronic engineer who was skilled in navigation and shipbuilding, and a biologist who was also an expert meteorologist. And then a physicist who was competent in the application of photography, a survival equipment engineer who was encyclopedic in his knowledge of Asia. And one of the things that's interesting is that they had just 2 buildings, fairly small lab space, but they worked directly with machinists. It was almost like having like our organic industrial base working hand in hand with the research and development people. So you had people who could build things along with the people who were designing them. So they'd go out to Spessudi Island was one of the places that they used, or they'd use the ranges. And they'd come back and they'd make changes and they'd go out. So they might do like 3 iterations of something within the course of the day. And another thing that they really encouraged was taking this equipment to the field, interacting directly with soldiers, hearing from them what worked, what didn't, what their needs were. So over the course of this 12 years, they did so many projects. I can't even talk about them all, but I have a printout of listing just the names of some of their projects beginning in 1964. And it's 20 pages long, and it's single-spaced, and it's just things like fiberglass pontoons, a lot of illumination product, working with early LEDs, trying to light things in the field, countermeasures, portable radars, really anything that they could use to protect the soldiers, to keep them safe. There were a lot of life-saving equipment, sort of like portable stretchers and things like that, but also efforts to detect incoming personnel, to repel them, to identify them, that kind of stuff, smoke screens, all this kind of stuff. So it's a really interesting piece of history that I didn't really know much about, but I found a report on the Limited War Laboratory.
I was ready to say, you've really done your homework here.
We're in a time of transition. We're in a time of transformation. But you have to remember that the Army is continuously in transformation. We might not have called it that in the past, or maybe we called it something different. But there's always been an effort to look forward, to see what's coming down the line, to innovate and experiment and figure out what we need to meet that incoming challenge. So that's really what I hope to convey to our listening audience today, that Aberdeen Proving Ground is the home of innovation and has been since 1918, 1917. And we're here to support the nation and the Army and the soldier. And I hope that's something that we can take away as we meet the Army's 250th birthday and look forward to the next 250 years.
Susan, I could not have said it better myself. What a way to go out on top.
And we want to let our audience know we're going to be taking a little bit of a summer break. This is just,
That we will.
This has been a fantastic little project for us to talk about Aberdeen Proving Ground, Edgewood Arsenal, the Army's 250th birthday, but, it's a lot of work.
I'm going to have to let this episode sink in a little bit because, I think we just really touched on a lot that we haven't spoken about before, and all just for the Army's 250th. But we will be returning back in the fall with more episodes.
That's right, Sean.
So make sure you hit that follow button, like button, Sean is awesome button, and Susan is a genius button. And we will see you again in the fall. Thank you for joining us.